The first letter arrived quietly, slipped into the mailbox like any other piece of routine mail. It looked ordinary at a glance, stamped with the HOA's logo and formatted in their usual stiff, legal tone. But the name printed on the envelope stopped everything cold. It belonged to a relative who had been dead for years. At first, it felt like a clerical mistake, the kind of error that happens when databases aren't updated properly. The letter demanded payment for alleged violations, complete with late fees and threats of escalating penalties. The date, the amount, and the language all assumed the recipient was very much alive. The shock wasn't just emotional, it was unsettling. This wasn't a reminder. It was an accusation sent to someone who could never respond. Within days, more letters arrived. Each one bore the name of a different deceased relative, all once connected to the same property through inheritance records. Some had passed decades earlier. Others more recently. Every letter followed the same template: violations, fines, warnings of liens, and threats of legal action. The HOA had not just made one mistake, they had systematically targeted the dead. It became clear this wasn't random. The association had combed through old ownership records and fired off enforcement notices without verifying whether the people they were accusing even existed anymore. The mailbox became a grim reminder of how recklessly authority can be wielded when no one stops to check the facts. Seeing the names of deceased family members reduced to debtors on HOA stationery was deeply disturbing. These were people who had built lives, raised families, and left legacies, now treated as delinquent rule-breakers. Each letter felt like an insult layered on top of grief. The HOA's language was cold and threatening, warning of legal consequences if payment was not received. The idea that an organization could harass the dead without hesitation revealed something deeply broken in how they operated. This was no longer about fines. It was about disrespect, negligence, and a complete lack of humanity. Attempts were made to resolve the issue quietly. Emails were sent explaining that the recipients were deceased. Copies of death certificates were offered. Phone calls went unanswered or were brushed aside with vague promises that the issue would be reviewed. Instead of stopping, the HOA escalated. New letters arrived marked "Final Notice." Late fees were added. The tone became more aggressive. The association behaved as though silence from the dead confirmed guilt. Their refusal to pause or investigate transformed incompetence into something far more serious. What the HOA didn't realize was that sending debt collection notices to deceased individuals is not just unethical, it can be illegal. Federal consumer protection laws exist to prevent exactly this kind of harassment. By continuing to send fines, threats, and legal warnings to people they knew, or should have known, were deceased, the HOA crossed into dangerous territory. Each letter became documented evidence. Every escalation strengthened a potential case against them. What they thought was routine enforcement was, in reality, a growing legal liability. Every envelope was saved. Every letter scanned. Every timestamp recorded. The HOA unknowingly built a paper trail against itself. Their actions showed a pattern of negligence, willful ignorance, and reckless enforcement. The evidence revealed that the association never verified records, never paused enforcement, and never respected the legal status of the people they accused. What started as harassment turned into proof. The more they sent, the worse it became for them. Once the situation was reviewed by legal professionals, the gravity of the HOA's actions became clear. This was not a simple correction. The association had violated federal regulations governing debt collection and harassment. They had also potentially exposed themselves to civil penalties and damages. A formal notice was prepared outlining their violations, the evidence collected, and the consequences they now faced. The power dynamic shifted instantly. The HOA went from aggressor to defendant. The moment the formal notice was delivered, everything changed. Communication that once felt threatening suddenly turned apologetic. Emails arrived marked urgent. Phone calls were returned immediately. The same HOA that had ignored explanations now begged for discussion. Internal panic spread through their leadership as they realized the seriousness of their mistake. They were no longer dealing with unpaid fines. They were facing potential federal consequences. The HOA attempted to undo months of harassment in days. Letters were retracted. Fines were voided. Accounts were corrected. They claimed it was all an unfortunate clerical error. But the damage was already done. Their attempts at cleanup only confirmed that they knew they were wrong. Quiet settlements were proposed. Confidential resolutions were hinted at. The association's confidence evaporated under legal scrutiny. Behind closed doors, board members faced the reality of what their enforcement culture had become. Procedures were questioned. Leadership roles were reviewed. The individuals responsible for approving mass mailings without verification were suddenly liabilities. The HOA had to confront the consequences of treating enforcement like automation rather than responsibility. The dead had no voice, but the law did. News spread quickly once the situation became known. Neighbors were horrified to learn that the HOA had been sending fines to deceased residents. Trust eroded overnight. People began questioning how their own information was being handled. Attendance at HOA meetings surged. Residents demanded transparency, accountability, and change. The association's reputation suffered a blow it couldn't easily recover from. Under pressure, the HOA implemented new policies. Verification requirements were introduced. Enforcement procedures were slowed down. Legal oversight was added. What should have existed from the start was now forced into place by consequence. The association's authority became cautious, restrained by the fear of repeating its mistake. The culture of aggressive enforcement cracked. For the family, the ordeal was exhausting but necessary. The names of deceased relatives were finally cleared. Their records corrected. The harassment stopped. What remained was a sense of quiet justice. The HOA no longer had the power to rewrite reality with form letters and threats. The truth had prevailed, not through shouting, but through documentation and law. Even after resolutions were reached, the HOA could not escape the lesson. Every enforcement action now carried hesitation. Every fine required double-checking. The association learned the hard way that authority without accountability is dangerous. The dead they tried to intimidate became the reason their entire system was dismantled and rebuilt. The story became a cautionary tale whispered in meetings and shared quietly among residents. It proved that HOAs are not above the law, that paperwork does not replace responsibility, and that even the dead deserve dignity. The fines were gone. The threats erased. But the regret remained, etched into the association's history as the moment they crossed a line they could never uncross.